Pause for a moment and listen carefully, because something has just shifted in the unseen realm concerning your name. This is not an ordinary message, and the fact that you are hearing these words right now is not coincidence. Heaven has a way of interrupting the ordinary at the exact moment truth is ready to rise. Anointed One, for a long time you carried a story about yourself that was written by someone else's lies. You were labeled the difficult one, the black sheep, the one who caused tension simply because you refused to participate in what your spirit knew was wrong. And while others repeated a narrative about you, heaven was quietly recording the truth of what you endured. But something has changed. In the last hours, a veil has begun to lift. The same God who declares through the book of Ecclesiastes that there is a time for every purpose under heaven has reached the moment where hidden things can no longer remain buried. A family member is beginning to see what was once concealed, and the weight of that realization is shaking their heart. You may have felt a strange release in your spirit recently, as if a burden you carried for years is suddenly loosening its grip. Stay with this message. What is unfolding around your family right now is not random. It is divine vindication beginning to surface. Monty Chosen One, there is a reason the atmosphere around your life has begun to feel different lately. Something that once pressed against your chest like a heavy stone is starting to lift. And even if you cannot fully explain it, your spirit recognizes that a shift has begun. For a long time, you carried a weight that no one around you seemed willing to acknowledge. You walked into rooms where conversations stopped, where eyes looked through you as if they had already decided who you were, without ever listening to your heart. You know that feeling, Anointed One. The strange ache of being discussed in places where you were never invited. The quiet pain of realizing that the story being told about you did not match the truth you lived every day. Many nights you lay awake wondering how the narrative became so twisted, how the people who shared your blood could look at you through a lens so distorted. But what you must understand right now is that heaven never lost sight of the truth. There were moments when you felt like the only witness to your own integrity. You tried to explain yourself, but your words seemed to bounce off walls of assumption. So eventually, you stopped explaining, you stopped defending, you carried your pain in silence and learned to speak to God about things you could no longer say to people. I know that season well, Chosen One. I remember times in my own life when I sat in a quiet room after everyone had gone home, asking heaven why truth sometimes travels so slowly while lies seem to sprint ahead. In those moments, it feels like injustice has the final word. But heaven works on a different clock, and the God who sees in secret never leaves a story unfinished. What has been happening around your life is not just emotional tension or family misunderstanding. There has been a spiritual strategy at work, a pattern designed to place the burden of every conflict onto your shoulders. Whenever there was confusion in the family, somehow your name was attached to it. When emotions rose in the room, fingers quietly pointed in your direction. Over time, a label began to grow around you. Maybe they called you too intense, too sensitive, too difficult to understand. Perhaps they whispered that something about you was unstable. But what they did not recognize was that the discomfort they felt around you had very little to do with your behavior. It had everything to do with the light you carried. When a person refuses to participate in dysfunction, they become a mirror for everyone else in the room. And mirrors have a strange effect on people who are hiding things from themselves. Some will look at that reflection and decide to grow. Others will decide that the mirror is the problem. Many of you watching know exactly what that feels like. You tried to speak honestly about things that were hurting the family, and suddenly you became the one causing division. You set healthy boundaries, and somehow those boundaries were interpreted as rebellion. You refused to pretend everything was fine, and suddenly you were labeled the troublemaker. But heaven has been observing this entire pattern, and the season of quiet observation is ending. What your spirit has been sensing recently is the beginning of exposure. Somewhere, perhaps in a conversation that was never meant to reach the surface, perhaps in a message accidentally revealed, perhaps through a moment of divine clarity that arrived in the middle of the night, a family member has begun to see what was previously hidden. And when the veil lifts like that, it is rarely a gentle experience. Truth arrives with weight. It forces people to re-examine memories they once interpreted incorrectly. It causes them to replay moments they dismissed before. Right now, that family member is looking back through the history of your relationship with new eyes. They are remembering conversations where you tried to explain yourself but were interrupted. They are recalling the times when you stepped away from gatherings, not because you wanted distance, but because you needed peace. They are realizing that while they were listening to whispers about you, you were carrying burdens they never bothered to ask about. And as those realizations begin to stack on top of one another, something heavy begins to happen inside the heart. Starts to rise. The tears you sense from them are not small emotions. They are the sound of a conscience waking up. When a person suddenly realizes they believed a lie about someone who loved them, the realization hits like a wave. They begin asking themselves questions they never considered before. How did I miss this? Why did I believe that story so easily? Why did I not look deeper into the situation? That is the moment when the architecture of deception begins to collapse. For years, a certain voice may have been influencing the atmosphere around your name. Perhaps there was someone in the family who always seemed to carry information about you, someone who appeared concerned, but somehow always managed to plant seeds of suspicion. Did themselves as the calm observer, the neutral messenger, the one simply sharing what they had heard. But behind that calm exterior, there was something else working quietly: division. This is a pattern that has existed in families for generations. One person learns how to position themselves as the interpreter of everyone else's behavior. They become the storyteller. They filter events through their own perspective and distribute those interpretations to others until their version becomes accepted as truth. And once that pattern is established, the entire family dynamic begins to orbit around the narrative they created. What happens when that narrative begins to crack? What happens when someone suddenly sees evidence that contradicts everything they believed? Chosen one, that is where you are standing right now. The moment when a long-standing illusion begins to unravel. The person who once repeated those stories about you is now seeing pieces of reality that no longer fit the old script. And the more they examine those pieces, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. They are recognizing that the information they trusted may have been shaped by jealousy, insecurity, or fear. They are beginning to realize that the person who spoke most confidently about you may have been protecting their own image the entire time. That realization is not easy for them to accept. Pride resists it. Ego resists it. Truth has a way of continuing to rise once it has been uncovered. It starts small, like a quiet whisper in the mind. Then it grows into a question that refuses to go away. And eventually, it becomes a realization that changes everything. Right now, the Spirit of God is allowing that realization to take root. The person who once nodded along with accusations about you is starting to see the pattern that was hidden beneath the surface. They are connecting moments that once seemed unrelated. They are recognizing that the person who criticized you the most was often the one creating conflict behind the scenes. They are remembering conversations where details did not quite add up. And suddenly, the entire picture shifts. What once looked like your problem now begins to look like manipulation. What once sounded like concern now feels like control. What once seemed like harmless gossip now reveals itself as a strategy of separation. One Heaven has allowed this moment to arrive because the season of distortion cannot continue forever. When God decides it is time for truth to stand, even the most carefully constructed stories begin to fall apart. The same God who declared through the Gospel of Luke that nothing hidden will remain concealed is now bringing that promise into motion in your life. And the first sign that truth is rising is not celebration, it is tears. Because when someone finally sees what they missed, the weight of that realization can break their heart open. And what is unfolding in that heart right now is only the beginning, or chosen one. The moment truth begins to awaken inside a person who once misunderstood you is not a quiet experience. It is unsettling. It shakes the ground beneath everything they thought they knew. That family member who is now weeping is not simply reacting to one new piece of information. They are watching an entire structure of belief collapse in front of their eyes. Memories they once interpreted one way are now revealing a completely different meaning. Conversations that once sounded like evidence against you are suddenly revealing the fingerprints of manipulation. This is the painful process of awakening, and you must understand something important in this moment, Anointed One. When Heaven begins exposing deception, it rarely does it halfway. The Holy Spirit begins rewinding the tape of history inside a person's mind. Moments from years ago start returning to their memory, but this time the fog is gone. The context is clearer. The voice that once sounded trustworthy now sounds suspicious. The details that once seemed harmless now feel calculated. Right now, that family member is remembering things they once dismissed. They are remembering the way certain conversations about you always seem to happen when you are not present to speak for yourself. They are recalling how the same individual who warned them about you was often the one creating tension in other relationships as well. Patterns are beginning to appear where they once saw isolated incidents. Chosen One. When a lie survives for a long time, it usually does so because it is supported by repetition. The same narrative is repeated again and again until it begins to feel like fact. That is how deception builds a stronghold inside families. One voice whispers suspicion, another voice agrees with it, and soon the entire atmosphere begins to reflect that distortion. Before long, no one remembers where the story even started. But truth has a different nature. Truth may travel slowly, but once it arrives, it carries a kind of weight that lies cannot sustain. And that is exactly what is happening now. This family member is beginning to see the origin of the story that once shaped their opinion about you. They are realizing that the person who spoke most often about your supposed flaws was often projecting their own fears and insecurities onto your character. This realization brings a deep sense of sorrow, because suddenly they understand something they did not recognize before. While they were believing the accusations against you, you were still loving them from a distance. While they were repeating things they heard about you, you were praying for their well-being. While they were doubting your intentions, you were carrying burdens they never saw. That realization is heavy, Chosen One. It is the kind of moment that makes a person sit in silence, replaying their actions again and again in their mind. They start asking themselves difficult questions. Why did I not ask them directly? Why did I assume the worst? Why did I trust someone else's interpretation instead of listening to their heart? But even this painful reflection has purpose, because conviction is often the first step toward healing. The tears you sense from this family member are not simply regret. They are the beginning of transformation. When a person's conscience wakes up, it creates a space where truth can finally take root. You must also understand that what you endured was not random misunderstanding. There was a spiritual pattern behind it. Throughout history, people who carry clarity and conviction often become targets for projection. When someone refuses to participate in unhealthy dynamics, it forces others to confront realities they would rather avoid. And sometimes the easiest way to escape that discomfort is to place blame on the person who exposed it. You were never meant to carry that blame. You were simply the one who refused to pretend everything was fine when it was not. That courage may have made others uncomfortable, but it also made you a catalyst for change. And now, heaven is allowing that change to begin. The person who once influenced others against you is starting to lose their grip on the narrative. Their contradictions are becoming visible. The small details that once seemed insignificant are now forming a pattern that cannot be ignored. This is why the atmosphere around the situation feels different. When deception begins to lose its power, the energy of the entire environment shifts. Chosen one. You may even feel that shift inside your own body. Some of you have noticed a strange release of tension lately. Your shoulders feel lighter, your breathing feels deeper. The constant pressure you once felt when entering certain spaces is starting to fade. That is not imagination. It is the physical response of your spirit, recognizing that the burden of false accusation is being lifted. For years you carried the emotional weight of other people's assumptions. You walked into rooms knowing that conversations about you had already taken place. You felt the silent judgments in the air, even when no one spoke them aloud. That kind of environment creates a heaviness that is difficult to explain. But that heaviness cannot remain once truth begins to surface. The same family member who once listened quietly to accusations is now looking at those accusations through a completely different lens. They are realizing that the person who appeared most concerned about your behavior was often the one stirring the most confusion. And the more they examine that realization, the clearer the pattern becomes. The enemy believed that if he could isolate you from your own bloodline, he could weaken the assignment on your life. Isolation is one of the oldest strategies used against people who carry purpose. If you can convince someone that they are alone, that no one understands them, that everyone has turned against them, it becomes easier to silence their voice. But heaven has a way of reversing what darkness tries to establish. What once looked like rejection is now being revealed as protection. What once felt like abandonment is now being understood as a season where God was preserving your heart, while truth slowly made its way to the surface. And right now, that truth is knocking on the door of a conscience that can no longer ignore it. What is unfolding inside that family member's heart right now is deeper than simple regret. It is the slow, painful awakening that happens when a person realizes they were standing on the wrong side of truth. This kind of realization does not arrive quietly. It moves through the mind, like a storm pulling old memories out of places they were buried and forcing them into the light. They begin to replay moments they once ignored. Words you spoke that once sounded defensive now sound honest. The distance you created that once looked cold now looks like self-preservation. You must understand something, Anointed One. When a person finally sees the truth after years of believing a distortion, their heart goes through a kind of spiritual shaking. Their pride begins to crumble. The certainty they once carried about the situation disappears, and in its place comes humility. That is why the tears are flowing. Not because they suddenly feel sorry for themselves, but because they are recognizing the depth of what you carried while they misunderstood you. Right now, they are remembering the times you tried to explain yourself but were quickly dismissed. They are remembering the look in your eyes during family gatherings when you sensed that something was wrong but no one would say it out loud. They are recalling moments when you stepped away quietly, instead of arguing moments that once looked like withdrawal, but were actually acts of dignity. There is something powerful about the kind of silence you maintained. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of restraint. You knew that defending yourself against a story already accepted by the crowd would only create more chaos. So you carried the weight quietly and placed the situation in the hands of God. That decision may have felt lonely at the time, but heaven saw every moment of restraint. There is a verse that many people quote when they are facing injustice, and it comes from the book of Isaiah chapter 54, where it declares that no weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment shall be condemned. Most people imagine that condemnation happening through confrontation. They imagine a dramatic moment where the truth is shouted from the rooftops. But often, heaven condemns the lie in a quieter way. It allows the truth to reveal itself inside the conscience of the very people who once believed the accusation. Instead of you defending yourself, the evidence begins to rise around them until they cannot ignore it anymore. That is exactly the stage you are entering now. Family member who is awakening to the truth is starting to recognize the pattern that existed around your name. They are noticing that the same individual who criticized you often seemed to benefit from the division they created. They are remembering subtle comments that once sounded like concern but now feel like manipulation, and the more they examine those memories, the clearer the pattern becomes. There is a reason this realization feels so intense for them. It is because they are discovering that they participated, whether knowingly or unknowingly, in a narrative that wounded someone who loved them. That kind of awareness can make a person feel sick to their stomach. It creates a deep sense of responsibility. But do not despise those tears. They are part of the healing process. When the heart breaks open like this, it creates space for repentance. The person who once believed the story about you is now beginning to understand the cost of that belief. They are seeing how their silence may have allowed the narrative to grow. They are recognizing how easily they trusted someone else's interpretation instead of seeking the truth directly from you. And yet, even in this painful realization, there is a quiet miracle unfolding, because the same tears that reveal regret also prepare the ground for restoration. Chosen. Heaven is not only exposing deception, it is also softening hearts. The person who once looked at you through